Chapter 19 deals with the Reformation, but on a different front, because we're going to look at the Reformation in England. You might think, well, why is it separated? Why are we looking at it from these different perspectives? Well, to be clear, the Reformation that took place in Germany and in Switzerland, and those Reformations were theological, meaning they had a religious motivation. They wanted to get at what they believed to be truth, how the church should behave, concerning the freedom of the believer to have faith and things like that. So it was different, really, than what we see in England. It's not to say that the theological Reformation, that Luther and Calvin didn't have political consequences, because it had tremendous political consequences. It changed governments. But with Henry VIII, his primary motivation was at first political. He wanted to divorce his wife. And so because of the influence of Catholicism on the political system, he knew he wouldn't be able to get away with that unless he did indeed reform the Catholic Church, or the relationship between his kingdom and the Catholic Church, and that is exactly what he does. But he had a very political agenda in mind, and really with a lot of these reformers, none of them really wanted to break away completely from the Catholic Church, but that's sort of the name of the game. They had different motivations. They really wanted to kind of see, honestly, their motivations being far disparate, I would think, between Luther and Henry VIII, but they wanted the Catholic Church to kind of change at their request. That the Catholic Church doesn't really respond very well to that kind of criticism, and so there you have the Reformation. I do think, though, the way we are taught the Reformation, because we have a very Anglo-centric, very English influence on the colonies here that came, in New England. I think we've taught the Reformation from a very Henry VIII-ish kind of perspective, when really I wouldn't be so quick to give all the credit to Henry VIII, because I think it's the foundational kind of theological principles that we see with Luther and Calvin that ultimately go on to influence the way Protestant theology has continued even to this day. It's not to say that in England there wasn't a theological concern, because there was, and they had their own literature, and they even wrote, published their own Bible. So again, it had a tremendous theological consequence and religious consequence, but the primary motivation was Henry VIII wanted to kind of do what Henry VIII wanted to do. So in this chapter, you will of course read chapter 19 that deals with England in the Tudor Age, and you'll watch a documentary about Henry VIII, which will deal with everything I'm kind of saying now, his theological position and his perspective and his beginning of a new religion, and his relationship with his wives and his relationship with those around him. And the guy was kind of a little bit kooky, but you'll see what I mean by that. He was paranoid, but he changed the world too. And so this is definitely the Reformation. So along with this conversation that we're having here, you're going to have the opportunity to contribute through the discussion. It's called the Reformations with an S, intentionally, because we're going to kind of hash out what I'm talking about here, and kind of interested to see how you guys discuss it and how you engage in the concept of these sort of two differing perspectives, and how well you can kind of hash it out and have some dialogue between each other as well. And again, the documentary is fair game for an analysis, so keep that in mind. And then the last chapter in this module, chapter 20, coming up, we will end on the actual Catholic Reformation, as it's called, and what their response was to not only what was going on in with Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, but also what was going on with Henry VIII.